Hello, you are listening to Deeply Curious. My name is Cody Jensen, and joining me in our New York City studio apartment is Sarah Jensen, my wife.
Hello.
In this episode, we're going to be talking about the World Happiness Report, which just came out, the 2019 edition.
Mm-hmm.
And the World Happiness Report is something that's been going on since 2005, or I guess more specifically, maybe a little after 2011, because that's whenever the actual report came out, but the first study covered 2005 to 2011. And we have been given the World Happiness Report ever since, using data being collected since 2005, I guess is what I should say. But the 2019 World Happiness Report just came out. Sarah and I have both read it.
Yes.
And it is over 150 pages.
It's a lot of researchy words.
Yes,
it's not very exciting to read.
It's 150. It's 150 pages of academic research and hypothesis of the research.
Yeah.
So it is not a fantastical story, but it is fascinating data.
Absolutely.
Before we jump into the report, just want to let you know that this podcast is brought to you by the members over at our Jensen AV Club. That is our Patreon page. This podcast is supported by people just like you, giving little amounts or lots of amounts, whatever floats your boat. And we have different tiers of opportunities that you can get deeper access and exclusive content. This particular episode is executive produced by Christian B. Schmidt. And if you want to check out the Jensen AV Club and what all you can, how you can support what you get through your support, you can go over to jensenav.club.
Yes.
The link is also in the description, or you can just go to patreon.com and search for Cody Jensen, and it'll get you there as well.
Yep.
So jensenav.club.
Thank you.
All right, so jumping into the actual World Happiness Report. They talk a lot about, in the beginnings of it, just to kind of get all of us on the same page, of how they measure happiness.
Right.
And they use this thing, well, not completely, but one of the things they talk about a lot, and one of the things that is used from the World Gallup survey, I think that's what it's called, is this thing called the Cantrell ladder question. And that specific question is asking respondents to value their lives today on a 0 to 10 scale, with the worst possible life as a 0 and the best possible life as a 10. And this gives us the chance to compare happiness levels and inequality in different parts of the world. Mm-hmm. So then they spend a significant chunk of time basically proving the validity of their research.
Yeah.
Which, if you are a skeptic and you don't, believe it or want to know specifically why certain, all of this stuff is, you can download the World Happiness Report by going to worldhappiness.report and read that stuff. That makes up a good chunk of the reporting, because obviously they are academic scientists and things like that,
right,
wanting to show the results, but also prove the results. Right. So you have to, spend the time to do that. Once they do that, they start asking some very interesting questions, mm-hmm, and then hypothesize or even provide correlative evidence of why they think that. So I think before we, get into things, before we get into like what interested us the most in all that, I think the most interesting thing in general, and the thing that people, I mean, what I would want to know in the very beginning is the actual list, the rankings of the most happiest countries. So the list has a 156 countries listed. Before you read the happiness report, where would you have pictured the U.S. being?
Well, this is probably unfair because I'm a little biased against America. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean,
so I would have probably ranked it lower than it actually is. But not because, but that, see, it just makes me sound like a terrible person, I think, maybe. Because I just don't like America that much right now. So it's a very like personal ranking, not like, if I think about it on a world scale, like it's pretty, I mean, obvious, like, I mean, we're not doing too bad, whatever. But on a very personal level, I probably would have ranked it lower than what it is.
I probably would have put it generally where it's probably at.
Yeah.
But that's because I basically have come into this with a lot of prerequisite knowledge of like being very interested in this stuff.
Right.
And so I knew it wasn't even in the top 10, but I would have, I don't know where I exactly would have guessed it. But just to, we won't keep the carrot dangling here. The United States of America, the quote-unquote greatest country on earth, according to Americans. Nationalist Americans. The United States is number 19 on the list.
Yeah, we made the top 20, which is pretty good, I feel like. Although it does seem like, well, shouldn't we be like 2 or 3?
Yeah. I mean, it's like if you were to say like, okay, America, it's like, oh, well, we'd be like, okay, well, I guess we could see like Canada being happier.
Yeah, exactly.
You're like, but I mean, at least in the top 3.
Yeah.
No. Number 19. That would be preceded by Belgium, Germany, Ireland, United Kingdom, Luxembourg, Israel, Costa Rica, Australia, Austria, Canada, New Zealand, Sweden, Switzerland, getting into the top 5 of Netherlands, Iceland, Norway, Denmark, and the new number 1, Finland.
Yeah, so apparently we need to go live in Scandinavia.
Yeah, which Scandinavian countries have topped the list of happiness for a very long time. I mean, they were the top of the list of the very first happiness report, which led to a lot of debating. And I mean, even whenever the like Trump election was going on with, even in the primaries, whenever Bernie was running, and, because Bernie would use the data of, the happiness of the Scandinavian countries to like, basically emphasize his point on democratic socialism and look at the people of Finland, Denmark, Norway, Iceland, that type of stuff, and see how happy they are and all that type of stuff. And then obviously because it's political, people that were on the other side, picked it apart, and so on and so forth. I read a book though during that time because I was very interested, because Bernie was very appealing to me, but I was also like wanted to make sure I was educated. And so I read a book around that time called The Almost Nearly Perfect People. It's by Michael Booth, and it's behind the myth of the Scandinavian utopia. So it's an American guy who I believe he got married to a Scandinavian woman. So he, basically it was an American perspective of why the Scandinavian people are so happy. And he has lived many years of his life in Scandinavia, and he goes through every single Scandinavian country and kind of talks about the nuances and different things of Scandinavia, and why the Scandinavian people may be happier or may actually report happiness higher than other countries, not because they are actually happier, but because that is the culture of which they live in, to kind of the tall poppy thing that our friend Michelle was talking about in Australia, that you don't want to stand out. Like there's no, deviating from the cultural norm. And so that may lead to some of this. But anyways,
who knows?
That was a very interesting book, The Almost Nearly Perfect People.
Yeah.
So I guess, what were some of your initial thoughts?
On the ranking?
Yeah, I mean, just in general from reading the happiness report.
Well, I wasn't surprised, I guess I should say, but on the ranking. Like, I knew Scandinavian was going to be way up there. I knew that the UK was generally close to or comparable to the US, which it's 4 spots ahead of us, which is actually, I think, maybe better than I thought. I'm not surprised by the majority of the top 20 being Europe, just saying. But I don't know that I'm like shocked either way to find out that the US is 19. That seems fit.
Yeah, I think that the thing that we should all recognize, and then one of the things that they talk about in the World Happiness Report is that America did not gain spots from the last happiness report. We are losing spots.
I think that maybe is more fascinating to me, is like who gained and who lost. Like Finland won the first spot this time because they're gradually increasing U.S. obviously downgraded. So I highlighted this one part, but basically it says the substantial reductions in the United States were larger than they predicted, which I thought was really interesting too.
Yeah. And so there were quite a few different, I guess, questions that they asked and hypothesized about why the U.S., is falling in happiness.
Right, because by all accounts, we should be growing in happiness if you take in like the traditional, like our wealth is growing, the economy is great, all the things, that supposedly make a great economy and a great country are actually improving. But our happiness level as a country is falling. And so there's like something in there amiss, which I thought was really interesting too. Yeah,
so you would think basically as you would traditionally measure it, the GDP growth.
Yes, that's what the GDP. That's what I was.
So basically the money that everybody's making.
Yes.
As the country as a whole, the amount of money that we are all making as it goes up, then our happiness should also go up, right?
Traditionally, that's how it should go.
Well, yeah, that's the way that you would think.
Yes. But then you have to take into account all of the other, what was it, 6 categories or something.
Right.
It was like, you said freedom, generosity, like social circles.
Right,
things
corruption.
Like, government corruption, things like that, that you have to take into account too, I guess, that America's not doing so great, I guess. Here's one quote about how Americans should be happier. They said, by most accounts, Americans should be happier now more than ever. The violent crime rate is low, as is the unemployment rate. Income per capita has steadily grown over the last few decades. This is the Easterland paradox. As the standard of living improves, so should happiness, but it has not.
Mm-hmm.
I think that is one of the more fascinating things about this report because, I mean, obviously, like I said, we only have our American perspective and experience. And so those things really stuck out to me as far as like, okay, well, why, if supposedly America's doing so good, is everyone so unhappy?
Yeah. There were 2 papers that were towards the end of the happiness report that were on social media and addiction.
Yeah.
And so in America that they are hypothesizing that are a driver of one of the main reasons that Americans are unhappy in general, but have also led to the sudden drop in happiness.
Right.
But before we get there were a few other things in the previous papers that I thought were interesting too, like the question of, are happier people more likely to be engaged with politics?
That was fascinating.
And so basically, it was found that yes, being very satisfied as opposed to not being very satisfied is in association with 6.7 percentage point change in the probability of voting, a magnitude that rivals that of education. So a 6.7 percentage point change in probability of voting whenever you're talking about a subjective well-being survey of people who are satisfied with their life versus not satisfied with their life.
Right.
And along those same lines, other research has shown that in the United States, people who are depressed are less likely to vote.
Right.
And then in later in that paper, it also asks the question of, are happier people more likely to vote for incumbents? Yes. That was the conclusion of that. And then, are unhappier people more likely to vote for populist? So this was really interesting.
Yes.
So, I mean, it says there's no single definition of populism, making its measurement and empirical study problematic. But perhaps the key aspect of a populist ideology, which spans various different definitions, is anti-establishment worldview.
Okay. Yeah.
So populist politicians typically distinguish between the virtue of ordinary people on one hand and the corrupt elite on the other hand. So related themes in the study of the recent rise in populism have also included a growth in the success of parties promoting nativist and nationalist sentiment, as well as the opposition or rejection of cosmopolitan or globalization, which is, very much Trump. So, I mean, the Trump's America is very much against, is very nativist and nationalist and against, cosmopolitanism, which would be immigration and all of that.
And they're saying the unhappier you are, the more likely you are to go to
vote for populists. Yeah. So they go into kind of like questioning, is it unhappiness that is causing the rise of populist political parties? Or is it the alternative, that an explanation that it may be that the current rise in populism is best explained by demand side factors, but rather on the supply side of populist politics? So if this is the case, one important and interesting line of research may attempt to study the extent to which populist politicians have successfully developed ways of appealing to and tapping into the existing well of unhappy people.
Right.
Meaning, is it that unhappy people are calling for populist governments, or that populist leaders are coming in and tapping into the unhappiness of the people?
Right.
So I thought that was an interesting question.
Yeah. They did that again on a different chapter about volunteering and how happiness correlates with volunteerism and like giving your time away. But they said it can't be, there's no like, I don't know, guess strong evidence on like volunteering makes you happier versus just naturally happier people tend to volunteer.
Yeah.
It can be or is possible that it's either or, which I think is interesting to even look at too.
So they concluded that particular question with the final possibility could be that it is not the average level of well-being that is driving changes in support for populist political movements, but it rather has to do with the variance of subjective well-being. So well-being inequality. So it may be that it's not that it's not the amount of unhappy people that are causing the rise in populist governments, or that populist governments are tapping into unhappy people, that the actual rise is caused by well-being inequality. So just the larger the divide, in the amount of people who say that they're happy and the people that say they're not happy within the same country, lead to a more, populist government.
Yeah.
It's basically income inequality, just like in general, like that's massive in the United States. Like, income inequality is insane. And so it's kind of the same thing with well-being inequality.
Yeah. Which is really interesting because I think you don't ever hear about that kind of inequality. I mean, it's obvious if you have an income inequality, the people with lower income will have less means to have well-being, like their health care will be more difficult, things like that. It makes sense, but I only ever hear people talk about income inequality and not about well-being and happiness inequality, which is, I think, fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I really, that was some interesting evidence to me. And then in the next paper is what you brought up, is talking about charity. So giving of your time and giving of your money.
Yeah. Which I thought the giving of your time, it was fascinating. Just that there is no conclusive evidence either way, which is fascinating. But then also, specifically the giving of your money, there was, I guess, correlating evidence. I don't know if it was proven, but that spending money on people rather than yourself actually does prove happier. Like the people who were assigned to spend money on somebody else, and then the people who were assigned to spend money on themselves, the people who spent money on someone else reported higher levels of happiness at the end of the day.
Yeah.
Which I thought was really cool. Obviously, there's different factors to it. It's like who you're spending your money on. So like if you know them or not, if you can see the result of your money being spent and stuff like that, adds to the happiness level. But I thought that was a really cool thing that they found, because we're not really taught to be generous people, especially with our money. And so I like that they researched that.
Yeah. So whenever you're talking about giving of your time and giving of your money, why do you think that people find higher levels of happiness whenever giving of their money?
I think it's probably more tangible. I mean, we are a culture who values money very much so, and like can see the results of money more easily than I think, going and volunteering for an hour a week or whatever. You can't really see the results of that. Whereas if you give physical money and get to see the result of it, that is more enticing. I mean, what kind of person doesn't want to like experience that, I guess? I think probably like it's something that our culture really values. So it would make sense that we would get more fulfillment out of it, right? Like everything's kind of heightened.
Yeah. I mean, I was just thinking that the sentiment of show me where you spend your money and I'll show you where your heart is.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think even in like music and culture in that sense, a lot of people talk about how money really is the root of all evil. Because once you get a lot of it, you understand that it's not going to do anything for you, obviously past the hierarchy of needs, but it really does like corrupt a lot of things.
Right. And I think that, there's things in scripture that, say it's easier for a camel to pass through the eye of a needle than a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. And, all theology aside, it's just a parable of it is very difficult to maintain a humble attitude with a ton of money.
Right.
Because money, it's so easy to become a greedy person. And I think that whenever we allow ourselves to part with our money for no monetary gain, so not in the exchange of goods,
right?
It's just in giving away something that we earned, worked hard for, whatever you want to say.
Yeah.
The biggest idol in our Western context is money, and to sacrifice a piece of that for the well-being of others, I think that leads more to the feeling of having done good, i.e. happiness,
right,
than the giving of time, because time is not valued in our culture in the same way that money is valued.
Right. That's what I was saying. Like money is a much more important commodity, I think, to us than time, which is weird, but
yeah,
makes sense, I guess.
So then the next paper is The Sad State of Happiness in the United States and the Role of Digital Media.
Such a sad title.
Yeah. So that starts, the years since 2010 have not been good ones for happiness and well-being among Americans. Even as the United States economy improved after the end of the Great Recession in 2009, happiness among adults did not rebound to the higher levels of the 1990s, continuing a slow decline ongoing since at least 2000.
Yeah. And we've talked about this a little bit in previous podcasts about the correlations between digital and social media and like the younger generation, the new generation, and how anxiety and depression and suicide rates and everything is like so much higher. And I mean, that's all this whole chapter is about. But I thought what was interesting is they were talking about how a lot of it might be due to the fact that like we're just spending our time differently. It's not necessarily, well, or maybe it is social media, but it's not necessarily social media. It's the fact that social media is taking 6 hours of our day when we used to do other activities and projects that contributed to happiness. Yeah. So it's not necessarily, I thought that was really fascinating that it's not like, oh, social media is bad, but it's more like, well, it's taking away from activities that actually do contribute to happiness. I thought that was fascinating.
At least that's one, that is one avenue you could take, like one hypothesis of the data.
Right, it's all
take.
correlating.
Yeah, because it's like, I feel like the conclusion at the end is that it's a both and.
Totally. I just like that they threw that out there, because I do think that's something that nobody's talking about. We're all talking about like, okay, what's the deal with social media? Is it a problem? Is it good? Is it bad? It has, positive qualities, but also some really negative ones. And I think just saying like just looking at it like, okay, obviously there's positive qualities, but it's taking away time that we used to devote to activities that actually contribute to happiness, that is like proven to contribute to happiness, social media is taking that. I thought I like looking at it like that for me on a personal level, instead of just like, oh, I should cut out all social media, being like, oh, I should implement these new activities. You know what I mean?
Yeah. And so there are numerous indicators of low psychological well-being, such as depression, suicide, self-harm, and I guess self-harm increased sharply among adolescents since 2010, particularly among girls and young women. And it goes on to say that those in iGen, born after 1995, are markedly lower in psychological well-being than millennials born 1980 to 94 were where they were at the same age. So the teen age, it's that the iGen are markedly lower in psychological well-being.
Yeah, I think this section, I just love the title of it, but it says the rise of digital media and the fall of everything else.
Yes.
But in this section, they talk about over the last decade, the amount of time that adolescents spend on screen activities has steadily increased, accelerating after 2012, after the majority of Americans owned smartphones. By 2017, the average 12th grader spent more than 6 hours a day of leisure time on just 3 digital media activities: internet, social media, and texting, which I thought was 6 hours a day. Yeah. That is so much. But what I thought was actually interesting, they said other activities that typically do not involve screens have also declined. Adolescents spent less time attending religious services, less time reading books and magazines, and perhaps most crucially, less time sleeping. These declines are not due to time spent on homework, which has actually declined, which I thought was interesting, or stayed the same, or time spent on extracurricular activities. The only activity adolescents have spent significantly more time on during the last decade is digital media. So even though it's only correlating evidence, it seems pretty obvious to me, that it really is having a massive effect on our mental well-being.
Because the amount of time that kids spend online increased at the same time that sleep and in-person social interaction declined.
Right.
So that is in tandem with a decline in general happiness.
Yeah.
So if you look at the graph, if you download the report, the graph is on page 91. And it is a very interesting. It's probably one of the only graphs in the whole report that I just stared at and kind of just shook my head like, oh my gosh. Yeah. So it's a line graph going from 2006 to 2017 with the amount of internet hours, sleep, in-person social interaction, and happiness as all different factors. And as internet hours goes like significantly up at the exact same time, sleep goes down, in-person social interaction goes down, and happiness tanks with it.
Yeah, it says that sleeping, face-to-face social interaction, and attending religious services, less frequent activities among iGen teens, are instead linked to more happiness. But all 4 of them, happiness, sleep, in-person social interaction, all of it has decreased with the correlation of internet hours.
So just one sad piece of evidence is girls spending 5 or more hours a day on social media are 3 times more likely to be depressed than non-users. And heavy internet users versus light users are twice as likely to be unhappy.
Yeah, it's crazy.
So as adolescents spend more time on electronic devices and are less happy, and adolescents who spend more time on other activities are happier. I guess the question would be, this study, this data is on Gen Z. Because of the data available, it's much easier to study them.
Right.
Yes, adult brains are more developed in the prefrontal cortex and, all that type of stuff. But at the same time, it's the same.
I think it's the same. I think that by far, well, definitely millennials. I mean, we're practically in the same spot as Gen Z, except that we didn't have social media starting when we were in junior high, but starting in high school instead. So I mean, that is a difference, but still we're in the same boat, I think, as Gen Z. And I would imagine that adults like my parents' age adults, I guess I'm an adult now,
Baby
but
boomers.
I would imagine that they spend less time in face-to-face conversation as well. I mean, how could you not? Like, it just doesn't make sense. You have the smartphone in your pocket. It's highly addictive. Everyone knows it's not only addictive to young people. Like, that's not a thing. Like, addiction is addiction is addiction. So I would imagine that adults are spending less time face-to-face, less time sleeping, and everything the same as adolescents. It only makes sense.
Yeah. And I think that, I don't know, I just feel like that's pretty evident.
Yeah.
That,
I mean, yeah, I've seen it, examples of it in our own lives, like people like our parents' generation and older that just are sitting around on their phones just like everybody else. Like, I don't think they're immune.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I would say, just from evidence in my own life, the times whenever I spend more time on my phone, regardless if it's social media or not, but especially if it's social media, are basically those days I feel much less satisfied with my life and my day than if, I was off of my phone.
Right. Actually, so it's kind of weird. I had a dream last night, and I don't even know what the dream was, but I only remember that in the dream on my phone, I had 4 apps, and that's it. It was my phone, text messaging, music, and my camera. And that was the only things that were on my phone. And I woke up and I was like, I think that should be my goal. Like, I don't know why I don't know what my dream was about. I just remember that in my dream. And then I woke up and I was like, I think that's what I want my phone to be. And then I read this report this morning, and it literally, I was like, this is what my phone has to be. I got so inspired. And I haven't deleted all of the apps yet because, slow progress. But I did rearrange my whole phone. So any app that I eventually don't want on my phone, I put on the second page so I never see it. And that way, after I don't use it for a certain amount of time, I'll just delete it and call it good. So on my homepage is literally only 4 apps, and I'm so excited about it.
And you deleted all social media.
I did. I deleted all social medias, and I only have like the weather and those 4 apps on my home screen. I'm pretty pumped about it.
Yeah. So we did a podcast episode called Social Media, I think.
I think that's just the title.
And we talked a lot about this, and specifically talked about a book called The Coddling of the American Mind, I believe. Basically, the author of that book probably used the exact same data points that
seems likely
that the Global World Happiness Survey also used, because it came to the exact same conclusions. Because when you look at it on a graph, it's pretty obvious about just Gen Z, just the rampant levels of depression, suicidal thoughts, eating disorders, everything just dramatically increases with the increase of screen time, digital media consumption. And so when talking about that, taking that data and moving in and talking about us as adults, the last paper of the study,
this is the one that really I could talk about this for hours.
So it's called Addiction and Unhappiness in America. Yeah. And it starts with the United States, a mass addiction society.
Yeah. So I actually started thinking about addiction a couple, 2 or 3 years ago, and just kind of viewing addiction in a completely different way, because I think we're taught that like drug addiction is a thing and alcohol addiction is a thing, but everything else is just kind of like not, like caffeine is a drug, but for some reason we're like cool with it in society. So it's fine to need to have your coffee 5 times a day. And social media is another addiction. I just started looking at addiction completely differently than just the traditional like drug addiction stuff.
Yeah.
And I think this paper specifically like does such a good job of talking about that and like what it looks like in America. That it's very eye-opening because it talks about not just, it does talk about like opioids and drugs and alcohol and social media, but also like food addictions. And I mean, because America is super obese, and exercise addiction, and like just things that you would think aren't necessarily bad, but are addictions in America. And like, why are we so addicted? Is really fascinating.
So addiction in the way that this paper defines it is an addiction, generally speaking, is a behavior like substance abuse, excessive gambling, or excessive use of digital media, which individuals pursue compulsively in the face of adverse consequences known to the individual.
Yeah.
So that, obviously can be drugs, or whatever, but it's just an excessive use or excessive consumption of something, which individuals pursue compulsively, meaning that you are not in control anymore.
Right.
It controls you. You do that even though it has adverse consequences that you know about.
Right. I think like this quote I really liked. It said, at the outset of this chapter, it's worth emphasizing that if the U.S. is indeed suffering from an epidemic of addictions, the implications are crucial not only for public policy, but also for the rethinking of economic science. The free market theory taught in our university holds that consumers know what's best for them, with businesses efficiently and appropriately catering to those desires. The prevalence of addiction suggests a very different picture, that individuals may be lured into self-destructive behaviors, notably by businesses keen on boosting sales of their goods and services. Economists, of course, know of such risks, but dramatically underestimate their prevalence and significance, which I think is really fascinating because then it gets into the conversation of addiction to shopping and consumerism and advertising and everything that our society tells us we need more of, that it gets into that. And it talks about like, there are several like theories, I guess they have, for psychology and neuroscience of addiction. But there's like dopamine related theories, opponent process theories, self-control failure theories, and dual decision system theories, which, yeah, I don't know if we'll talk about all of those, but, I thought it was interesting what they said about dopamine related theories, because, we talk about that a lot with social media, like the notifications is like a dopamine hit, right? It says, for many years, it was thought that dopamine was itself a pleasure neurotransmitter. Now, dopamine is hypothesized to heighten the salience of stimuli, leading to a craving for the addictive substance or activity. So it's just like even changing our view on what dopamine is and does was really fascinating to me. It says the basic idea is that drug taking or addictive behaviors become compulsions to avoid the dysphoria associated with withdrawal. So it's not so much about getting the dopamine hit, it's about avoiding the withdrawal instead, which is kind of fascinating to think about. Like, oh, I don't get on social media so that I can have a dopamine hit. I get on it so that I don't have to have withdrawal, which is fascinating, I think.
Yeah.
I mean, it makes sense, but it's just a different way of looking at it.
Right.
Yeah.
You already said it, but I think it's worth hearing again, of just the last line of that quote that you said, that individuals may be lured into self-destructive behaviors, notably by businesses keen on boosting sales of their goods and services.
Totally.
And that is America. Like,
yeah,
all social media is trying to get you to spend more time on their app, because the more time you spend, the more time they can report to their shareholders that they held your attention. So this would be like they take all this data and they put it into like the monthly amount of time that people are on their apps, and that is measured, against other apps, so that they can know, so shareholders essentially can know whether they're making the right investment or not.
Yeah.
And so it is in their best interest always to get you to spend more time on their product than it is in their best interest to care about you as a healthy individual.
Right.
They don't care. They want you addicted, and they want you to spend time.
Because the addiction is where the money is, you know?
And that's not just social media. That's literally everything. I mean, you apply that to Coke wants you to only drink Coke.
Right.
Their enemy isn't even Pepsi. Their enemy is water.
Right.
They want you to drink soda.
Yes.
And they will do anything and everything to make that happen.
Yeah. Which they talk about in here. They use 3 examples, right? And sugar is one of them. I think one of the things I really wanted to point out is so they're talking about what they shorten it to dailies, but it's disability adjusted life years. So like how long you're expected to live, I think, right? Yeah. But it says, among all 196 countries, the U.S. ranks second overall in dailies lost to all drug use disorders, first in dailies from cocaine use, third in dailies from opioid addiction, and second in dailies from amphetamine use. The U.S. is moderate only for alcohol use disorders, ranking 39th, which is fascinating. These very heavy burdens of substance disorders are matched by the high U.S. rankings on other mental disorders. The U.S. ranks 5th in the world in dailies from anxiety disorders and 11th in the world from depressive disorders. Across all mental disorders, the U.S. ranks 4th. That's insane. Like, those numbers are actually crazy. Like, we are in the top 4. We're 4th in the world for all mental disorders. But then also we're 2nd in all drug use disorders. The only disorder that we're moderately ranked is alcohol, which is actually kind of weird.
Because we've moved on to harder stuff.
Right. Because we're looking for some things that'll actually help numb it's just like when I just got so sad when I read that, you know, because like, what are you supposed to do? This is kind of like, I think maybe the question this chapter is bringing up for me is like, okay, we can see the evidence, you know, that we're an addicted society. And we can also see that the government and businesses want us to be addicted. But like, how do you, and the general idea probably is that we turn to drug use and harder things because we're trying to cope with other, you know, stress and all of these mental disorders. So then like, how do you even, it seems kind of like a lose-lose, you know, like either you're going to be addicted or you're going to be like massively depressed and there's no other alternative, right? Like, so it seems. I mean, it just looks like when you're looking at this data, you're like, oh my God, it's kind of a lost cause.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that in there, the reason for that is because as we are gathering evidence, and as one of the papers in this shows, basically screen addiction is digital media and social media all lead down a path of anxiety, depression, and other mental disorders. And so, because we are addicted to those things, which are all social norms, not illegal, not looked down upon in any way, and also make us feel that we are actually missing out if we don't do it. And also we are lied to in the fact of how much it actually benefits you. It has benefits, but too much of a good thing type. And so basically getting to what you were saying is that, you either are addicted to the substances or you're depressed. But I think that, could be in the fact that we would rather take a substance than just make the self-control, decision and not get off of social media except for a certain amount of time a day or at all, depending on your level of self-control.
Right.
And then, limiting the amount of time you spend consuming digital media and increasing the amount of time that you spend in face-to-face interaction.
Right.
And non-digital media consumption.
Right. But I also think, you're talking about like we'd rather take a substance. We're taught that too. You can look at if we're talking about drug addictions, like pills that you are literally prescribed from doctors are highly addictive, and they just keep prescribing them to you because they're getting paid for it. You know what I mean? Like we're taught to just throw a substance over the as a Band-Aid. Like we're not.
Because we're corrupted by the free market, because they even talked about that in one of the papers.
Right, that's what I'm saying. Like all of it is such a, it's such a cycle, and it like all feeds into each other, and like it kind of feels like, okay, well, how do you fix it? I don't even know.
Yeah, because I would say whenever it comes to professions and whenever they study trustworthiness in professions, is like whenever they say a lawyer, the trustworthiness, is low. But whenever you say doctor, I would imagine, I don't, have that research in front of me, but a doctor is probably one of the most trustworthy professions that there is. And yet there are so many doctors that are manipulated or bought into the big pharma system. And, one of the papers points out that the makers of OxyContin, they not only have been sued multiple times, and basically it's not about being sued. It has been proven time and time again that they are using malicious tactics to get to buy doctors, to get doctors to prescribe and recommend the oxy products that are highly addictive
that everyone knows,
and they do everything possible to hide the addictive nature of them. But because of corruption in capitalism and the free market, they get away with it.
Yeah, because if a doctor tells me this is the prescription that you need, like who's going to be like, I think maybe I should research it. You know what I mean? Like you're supposed to trust like doctors. That's just, it's absolutely insane. So like everything feeds into each other in some form. And it's like when you look at all of it like laid out on paper like this, you're like, oh my God, how are we ever going to like, not just like, I mean, as an individual, I think I'm asking like, okay, how do I fix this in myself? Right. But then like as a whole, like, is it fixable? It's wild. It was talking about in here, it says, as we have seen, trying to maintain self-esteem and status in a more unequal society can be highly stressful. So it's talking about like the digital media and seeing people's lives as better than yours and like trying to keep up with that and stuff like that. It says this experience of stress can lead to an increased desire for anything which makes them feel better, whether alcohol, drugs, eating for comfort, retail therapy, or another crutch. It's a dysfunctional way of coping, of giving yourself a break from the relentlessness of the anxiety so many feel. And so it basically is talking about how like we turn to substances and we're addicted to multiple things at once to help us cope with the addictions of the other things.
Right.
And like,
I mean, that's essentially what I was saying is like the addiction to digital media causes you to have an addiction to an antidepressant.
Right, because we're so overwhelmed, and so we're like, oh, I have anxiety. Let me go to the doctor and get an anxiety pill. I'm not saying anything wrong with anxiety medication. I don't know, but like, it's just the idea of like, we're just like throwing things on top of each other to stop the overwhelming like feelings of anxiety and depression, and all it's doing is keeping us addicted to literally everything. I mean, even in my own life on some levels, or on small levels, I'm like, I mean, the reason I go get a chai every day is to like soothe something in myself. It's not because I need it or want it necessarily, but it's like, it is an addiction, and like the reason I sit on the couch at night and scroll social media is because I don't want to think about other things, you know, like, and on small, those are small tech, you know, like comparatively, but to think about like America as a whole, we're all doing that on some level. And like, how do you even start to tackle that? It's insane.
Yeah, the paper says the U.S. is in the midst of epidemics of several addictions, both substances and behaviors.
Yes.
And according to Sussman's estimates, around half of the population in the U.S. suffers from one or more addictions at any one time.
Totally.
50% of America is addicted to something.
Multiple things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's crazy. Like,
but I don't doubt it at all, because I think one of the more fascinating things that they mention a few times is the addiction to exercise. Because of the culture we live in that's telling us to look a certain way, we're exercising for incorrect reasons. You know what I mean? Like, everything is so backwards. I thought one of the things that I thought was really interesting it's under the subject or the section called supernormal stimuli. It says the third major hypothesis points to a core design feature of a market economy. Addictive products boost the bottom line. That's America in one sentence. Addictive products boost the bottom line. Yep. You know, but it says Americans are being drugged, stimulated, and aroused by the work of advertisers, marketers, app designers, and others who know how to hook people on brands and product lines. This is the part that really fascinated me. If Sigmund Freud is the psychologist who made the unconscious the basis of his theories, it was his nephew, Edward Bernays, the inventor of modern public relations, who preyed on the unconscious to sell goods. Bernays trafficked in behavioral conditioning, for example, famously associating cigarette smoking with sexual allure of the female models who were photographed smoking in public, a dubious first for women. So he made it like super sexy, even though everyone knows that smoking is so terrible for you. But I thought it was really fascinating talking about Sigmund Freud, and then his nephew is the one who sort of like manipulated his work for marketing. I thought that was kind of fascinating.
One thing that I found really fascinating was in the theories of, you know, you mentioned the dopamine related theories and all that. The one that I think, besides the dopamine one that fascinated me the most, was the self-control failure theory. Yeah. And the self-control failure theory hypothesized that self-control in general is an exhaustible resource. And that when the resource is depleted because of stress, exhaustion, and other reasons, the result is short-sighted decisions and impulsivity. In general terms, stress in various sorts leads to depletion, which leads to the addictive behavior.
I 1000% relate to that. Like, I feel like I can do pretty good. Like, I know it's good for me. I know it's bad for me, you know, whatever. But on a day, I mean, I think everybody has felt it. Like, on a day when just everything gets to you, everything beats you down, at the end of the day, you're like, screw it. I'm going to go get a pint of ice cream. Right. We all know what that is. You know what I mean? I think that theory, I don't even care how true it is. It's true. Like, it has some basis for fact, because we all know what that's like, I think.
Yeah, and you say, I'm going to work out every day. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do this. And as you use up the self-control, right, you start to slack in other areas. Or even if it was just in one area, like let's use New Year's resolution for an example, that you say, all right, I want to work out. And then we've all heard and we all know that by February all of those resolutions are pretty much gone, because our self-control was depleted by the stresses and anxieties of all the other crap going on in life. That like it doesn't happen.
It makes me feel a little bit better about my lack of self-control.
One thing that you were talking about with the companies, the addictive America and the addictive behavior and the bottom line and all that. That reminded me of the story in The Power of Habit by Charles Duhigg. He talks about in that book, a fascinating story of the product Febreze.
Yeah.
And how Febreze was essentially a product failure because the way it was marketed, it was marketed as if something smells, you spray it,
right?
It no longer smells. But then they found through research that people go nose blind to things, and they actually don't even realize that things are smelling, because if your whole house smells like a pile of cats, if you live among that pile of cats, essentially you just completely go nose blind and you don't even realize that it's smelling anymore.
Totally.
And so whenever they were doing their marketing of, hey, if your house smells like a pile of cats, spray the Febreze and it won't smell anymore. And people would be like, doesn't smell.
Smells fine.
And so they basically didn't work. So they figured out a way to hack the habit of cleaning. And so they started marketing through research and blah, 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 blah. Like it's a whole chapter in the book. In the end, they found that when they started marketing it towards homemakers to spray at the very end of cleaning.
Right.
So they do all the vacuuming and the dusting and the pile, picking up everything. And at the very end, you spray the Febreze.
It's smell, like the reward.
You smell the fresh, Febreze scent, and you're like, clean. So they hacked the habit of cleaning, that at the end of cleaning, you no longer feel that the home is clean unless you spray the Febreze and smell the freshness. Even though the house is fine, it is clean. But by having the fresh Febreze scent at the end of cleaning, that is like the mental signifier of like, the cleaning is done.
Yeah.
And so essentially Febreze is a successful product because it is, quote unquote, addictive.
Right.
In the fact that it has hacked the habit of that. And now, to certain people, it is an addictive quality of being needing to use it at the end of cleaning. Anyways, so just the whole line that you mentioned about companies hacking our brains.
It's so true, and it's crazy that like you can know it and still like fall prey to it. You know what I mean? It's kind of insane. The very last section is called Failures of Government Regulation. It says, in view of the multiple addictive epidemics underway in the U.S. that are contributing to shockingly adverse public health outcomes, obesity rates among the highest in the world, rising rates of adolescent depression, rising age-adjusted suicide rates since the year 2000, a searing opioid epidemic, and falling overall life expectancy, which is really sad to me. One would expect a major public policy response. Yet the shocking truth is that the U.S. public health responses have been small, even insignificant to date. If anything, the epidemics expose the remarkable power of a corporate vested interest in American political life, power that is so great that it has forestalled any effective responses that would jeopardize corporate profits and control.
Yeah.
Which I think is kind of crazy. And they give some examples, the OxyContin being one, about how it is literally the reason for the opioid epidemic in America. The beverage industry with the sodas and the sugar, and how they literally sued the city of San Francisco.
Yeah, actually, can I just read that one real quick? Because I think...
Yeah, it's wild.
This one, should be implanted in your brain.
Yeah.
So the beverage industry has strenuously resisted the responsibility or regulation for the obesogenic risks of sugar-based sodas. It has fought relentlessly against sugar taxes aimed to induce consumers to buy less expensive, safer beverages. And when one city, San Francisco, imposed a mandatory warning on sugar-based beverages, which would say, drinking beverages with added sugars contributes to obesity, diabetes, and tooth decay. This is a message from the city and county of San Francisco. The American Beverage Association and other plaintiffs successfully sued San Francisco in a ruling that epitomizes the alarming state of U.S. public policy. The U.S. Court of Appeals found that the mandatory warning was an infringement of commercial free speech under the First Amendment.
Which is absolutely insane. It's like they're getting away with not telling us. I mean, obviously, I think most of us know now, right? But like there should be warnings. Like,
well, it's just like in the fact that with smoking, it's like everybody
Right.
knows that smoking kills you.
right.
But there's a difference between knowing that smoking kills you and every single time you buy a pack of cigarettes, the entire side or entire back says, this will kill you.
Exactly. And then they also used the example of food industry and obesity. And that I thought was interesting that there's Heinz Kraft has a subsidiary called Devour Foods. And they used their 2019 Super Bowl ad as an example. And in the ad, the young woman declares, "My boyfriend has an addiction," showing her boyfriend gobbling up his food. She implies that she tried to lure him away from the food through spiced up sex, but notes of the food, "It's hard to resist." And then the ad ends with the message, "Never just eat, devour." And it's literally promoting overeating and overconsumption. And it's just kind of crazy. It says the list of corporate recklessness in the US goes on, and now especially implicates the tech industry as well, which has played no constructive role to date in addressing the alarming trends of adolescent screen time and the ensuing depressive disorders described by Twinge, which was one of the resources in this volume. As every major study of Facebook has shown, the company is duplicitous in use of personal data, relentlessly focused on its bottom line, there it is again, and steadfastly dismissive of the dire consequences emanating from the use of its product and services. I think it's just really sad that we live in such an addictive culture and that big business and government and whoever is like perpetuating it. And it's like I said earlier, like it seems kind of like a lose-lose. I don't really know how because you think about like, okay, I can delete social media, right? And start there. But then you think about your food and you're like, pretty much anything you're buying at the grocery store is going to be way high in sugars and salt and like all kinds of things. And like, obviously you have the soda and coffee and whatever addictions, and then also you have like the models and the magazines that are telling you to look a certain way, so you're like obsessively exercising and like worrying about eating healthy things, which I think maybe exercising is like, I still think whenever I say it as an addiction, I'm like, it's probably the least bad addiction. Like if you're going to have an addiction, at least it's like keeping your body healthy. Although I think for the wrong reasons is not okay.
For me, it all comes down to freedom.
Yeah, but it's just like you think about it all in relation to like our culture and like how we live, and it just is so overwhelming, and I think really sad. I
think go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say that I love that this report came out, that I can look at it like on paper and be like, okay, like it gives kind of like a structure for where to begin for yourself, I think. And like, okay, so these graphs show this specific thing and I can't deny it because they have data ranging from 2005 to 2019, like I think it's pretty clear. So like now it gives you maybe like a perimeter to like put practices in place for yourself on different subjects, whether it's food or exercise or social media or whatever, which is helpful. Yeah. It's actually really inspired me on a lot of different levels in my life. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think that for me, like in, I guess one of the things that baffles me or saddens me about our culture is that with some of this stuff, like that, basically like that, the ad from Devour Foods, you know, it's like the whole ad was, treating frozen food as porn, like the entire, like every scene.
It was combining multiple addictions for you. It was eat all of this stuff and we're all addicted to sex. So, you know what I mean? Yeah. Like
it was basically like, it was alluding to that he was actually addicted to porn. Right. But what he was actually looking at was frozen food pictures. Right. And it was glorifying the addiction in general. Yeah. And I think that just in our everybody's everyday life, just thinking even just about how socially acceptable the addiction to caffeine is, whether it's in coffee or soda or whatever, like people not only are just like 100% okay with saying like, I have to have my morning coffee or, whatever, like, I need at least 2 cups a day or, whatever, like they're okay with saying that. But I feel like a lot of this stuff is also said with a little bit of pride.
Oh, totally. I mean, that's, well, the coffee is an obvious example, but I wrote about that, like, I think in 2014, but it's this idea of like, but first coffee, and like burning the midnight oil. The new phrase of that is like, oh, drinking 5 cups of coffee to pull an all-nighter. Like, that's what we do just to work more. But like, I don't know why. It's so
and
wild.
I think this isn't to, I am not saying this to stigmatize anything, because I mean, even I would say in all illegal, or I mean, in all legal substances, I think that within reason and within moderation,
absolutely,
like it can be enjoyed.
I'm
like
a big believer in moderation.
It's like whether that is having a coffee, like there's nothing wrong with having a coffee.
No.
And I would, to the other side of like in states that it's legal, there's nothing wrong with like having marijuana either.
Right.
But do either one of those things control your life? If yes, then it's a problem. Like that.
Right.
So I guess I'll turn that around and I'll say, for me, the way that I view this stuff is, I don't care if I have a coffee as long as I am in control of the coffee and the coffee not in control of me.
Right.
I'm okay with having eating a certain food or whatever it is. The entire thing with me and my personality is freedom, and having the freedom of things controlling me, even if it is me controlling my, like, it's not controlling myself. It's more so that it's not other people controlling me.
Right.
It's society or, corporations, substances, all of that stuff. Whenever I look at that thing, all those things, if it is taking control of myself and I am not the one saying yes or no to whether or not I'm going to spend time on social media or open my phone, those are the things that I want to actively find parameters to put around so that I can enjoy those things if I want. Or if I can't, then I just like
I think it
whatever.
takes a lot of self-awareness and honesty, because I mean, if you want to be addicted to something, you will. You know what I mean? Like, it takes a lot of hard work to admit an addiction and then to admit that you're doing something because you're addicted. Right. And then actually not do that thing. But I do think that is the way. I agree with that, like, approach, I guess, is like asking, is it controlling me or am I controlling it? Yeah. And then being honest about that answer is the start of it.
Yeah. And I think that applies to literally everything in
everything. Even good things, because kind of like this report is talked a little bit about, but it's like too much of a good thing. Right. Because it's like you said, it's not like getting a cup of coffee is bad. And it's not, I believe, like smoking marijuana is bad. It's just like too much of a good thing is not a good thing. Right.
And that's why exercise can become an addiction.
Right. Why anything really can become an addiction.
Like, one, I mean, eating food is a necessity of life.
Right.
But eating too much food is a problem.
Right. Or not enough food.
And the same thing with like exercise. It's like exercise is something that we all should be doing. But too much of a good thing can become a problem because it's in control of your life.
Yes, exactly. So I think, just too much of a good thing is not a good thing. And this whole paper was super eye-opening and fascinating. And has given me ideas and parameters to set around my own addictions and bad habits that I'm pretty psyched about.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think all of this kind of goes even into the conversation that we had about my existential crisis and just thinking about what actually brings happiness to people.
Right.
What is the actual meaning to our human existence, and what should we actually be focusing on? And I think that this, proves a lot of that, or like solidifies a lot of my thinkings in that so much of the things that we, especially as younger people, tend to focus on and spend all of our time doing and spend all of our time worrying about are ultimately things that not only don't actively add to our happiness, but do actively detract from our happiness and lead us into unhappiness, versus the first things we talked about, in that social media paper of face-to-face interactions.
Right.
And attending religious services, and reading, and but the main ones though were like
sleep.
That
was one.
Sleep, number one.
Yeah, we forgot about sleep.
Yeah. But sleep number one. But then after that, face to face, like actual social interaction with other human beings, in different forms. And I think that just choosing to focus on that versus focusing on other humans inside of a screen.
Right. I think one other thing that they mentioned in that same part is that they did not study purpose in correlation to happiness, which I thought, I don't know the exact words that they used, but I thought that was interesting too, that they were like, we can't say how big of a part purpose plays, although obviously it's a big part, because they didn't study it. But I just wanted to point that out, that like, because we're talking about happiness, and I feel like happiness can kind of be shallow a little bit in its definition, and what we're actually talking about is like purpose and like what gives our life meaning, and not just like what makes us happy. You know what I mean? I think that's kind of like the definition of happiness that they're talking about, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, if you want to read the World Happiness Report, you can go to worldhappiness.report. And if you don't want to read the whole thing, I wouldn't even honestly recommend reading the whole thing if it doesn't interest you. But the chapter, 5 and 7?
I think so.
On social media and then addiction, both of those well worth the read.
Yeah, really good.
And then I think also chapter 2, just about happiness globally.
Yeah.
Great ones. And so as we go about our lives from here, having now learned this information, for me, it just solidifies that I need to continue on the path that I'm going of reducing, keeping, spending much less time with digital media. Yeah. And continue to reduce the amount of time, in whatever means necessary.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I already cleaned up my phone, which I really am psyched about it. I feel like the front page being only like 4 apps makes my mind feel so good.
I kind of want to go outside sometimes without taking a phone.
Yeah, I would love to do that.
Seems crazy. Like,
I know, it's like life changing.
I know you're like, how are you going to do it?
Yeah.
Go outside without a phone. What?
I think the next thing I need to focus on is probably reducing the TV screen time. Because even if, like, I watch a lot of documentaries and stuff like that, but it's still a lot of TV time. Yeah. That I feel like isn't probably that great for me.
Yep. Well,
and my chai.
Yeah.
Throw that out there.
So thank you guys for listening to this episode. If you enjoy Deeply Curious, we would love it if you would help us by rating and reviewing us on iTunes, and also by just telling a friend about Deeply Curious, either by face-to-face word of mouth interaction, which may lead to a notch in your happiness, or you can share us on the dark and evil social media. And then if you want to help support this show and everything that we do as artists, within the show and outside of the show, you can do that by supporting us on Patreon, and that is what we call the Jensen AV Club.
Yes.
You can go to jensenav.club and see all of the different tiers of how you can get some exclusive content and deeper access to us and our art. Thank you, everybody who is already involved with the Jensen AV Club. And again, this episode is executive produced by Christian B. Schmidt. All right. We'll see you guys next week.
Bye.